flows of foreign capital that are pretty healthy, about $160 billion, about 40–45% of which is in foreign direct investment. We've had a very stable financial situation. The debt, the Latin American debt, which used to be a huge problem. There were events like this one around the world just to study the debt problem in Latin America. Well, today it doesn't amount to much. Only about 25% of the region's economy. If you compare that with the United States, where it's reaching 90%, I mean, it gives you an idea of how the tables have been turned. We also have a very interesting situation in the financial sector. The capital ratios are looking pretty healthy, about 12% across the board in Latin America. Some countries doing better than others. We have a new phenomenon as well, the emergence of the multi-Latinas, they call them. Latin American originated multinational corporations. If you look at any list, the Forbes list of the top 2,000 companies in the world, for the first time you begin to see a number of Latin American players. I believe Brazil has 33, 35, even more than Spain, which is a fully developed country. But you also have Mexico with 18 or 20, you have Chile with, I think, 8, Colombia, Peru, Venezuela with 3. So generally, we begin to see the emergence of big Latin American corporations that are able to play a role not only within the region, but also beyond the region. And we see also an interesting situation developing in some parts whereby countries that used to rely very heavily on countries outside of Latin America now are mainly doing business with the rest of Latin America. And that's the case of Bolivia. Its main trading partners today are within Latin America, within the region. That's, again, a new phenomenon for Latin America. So, generally speaking, I mean, this is a really a very novel environment for us. And the fact that we're just coming out of a huge financial and economic crisis, I think, makes this all the more interesting. I mean, Peru, for instance, will see its investment levels go up by about 12% this year, Brazil by about 20%. So there's a lot of movement taking place. Smaller countries that people don't usually talk about, like Panama, they're doing very well as well. A lot of very big corporations are now headquartered in Panama. You know, Heineken, 3M, Adidas, all of these companies now are headquartered there. So this is becoming a very attractive place in which to do business. Why is this happening? What are the reasons behind this? Well, I think this is going to be a topic for discussion for years to come. But if I could quickly mention 2 or 3 that I think are very important. I would mention first, of course, the reforms of the 1990s. We were discussing yesterday in Dr. Blanco's class how meaningful, how deep those reforms were. And I tend to be very critical of some of them. I think they were flawed. They could have gone much deeper. And generally speaking, many of those reforms did not go far enough. But still, clearly monetary and fiscal reform, trade reform, investment reform, generally the liberalization of the economy, all of that created an environment that in today's world with commodities reaching very high prices and a lot of demand for those commodities around the world has clearly helped Latin America. We also have, I guess, a situation in which the emergence of new players, such as India, such as China, is helping Latin America. That is really another very, very big reason why Latin America has been able to withstand the impact of the financial crisis. And of course, the other reason is the fact that with so much fiscal revenue, so much money coming in because of the sales of commodities, those governments are in a position to give a lot of handouts. And a lot of programs have been created in Latin America, such as Oportunidades in Mexico and Bolsa Familia in Brazil, and many others with which some of you will, I'm sure, be very familiar, have had an effect, at least in the short run, of helping people who were poor or extremely poor come out of that condition temporarily. Whether that's going to last or not, we don't know, and that's a very big open question. But generally speaking, of course, with all this revenue coming in, clearly some of that redistribution has impacted those statistics, and clearly part of the reason why some of those people are coming out of poverty has to do with all of that money that's coming in. However, I think that there's a big danger, and it has to do with the role that China and others are playing. And the danger is, as I mentioned before, that the distinction between the countries that are headed in the right direction and those that are not is being blurred. People, I think, are failing to notice some of the fundamental weaknesses that some of these countries have, and they may be in for a very big surprise somewhere down the line. I don't know exactly when, because that will depend on international forces that we cannot anticipate, but generally speaking, they could be in for a surprise. One cannot underestimate the effect that China has had on the region. I mean, if you look at, I was looking at trade figures, and it's really quite amazing. In the last 20 years, so between 1990 and today, trade has increased by a factor of about 40. So we had, I guess China was buying about $10 billion worth of commodities from Latin America in 1990. Today it's $400 billion. So this is a huge force at play, because many of these countries, including countries that I think are headed in the wrong direction, are in a position to satisfy that demand, and clearly are benefiting from that pull factor coming out of Asia and other parts. There's also a great deal of investment, not as much investment as trade. China has been promising a lot of investment in the region for the last few years, and that has been slow in coming, but it's beginning to happen. They've committed about $20 billion related to oil in Venezuela and other projects, and I think it's only a matter of time before we see China playing a huge role in terms of investment in the region. They're already playing a big role in Africa, as many of you know, in some parts of Central and Eastern Europe, so I don't see why Latin America will be left out of that. Eventually we will see something very similar to what has happened in the field of trade take place in that arena too. And the effect of this has been profound. I mean, those prices have skyrocketed in a way that has helped countries such as Bolivia, where they seem to be doing a lot of things wrong, in such a way that it looks like they're doing everything right. What's happened in Bolivia is really quite amazing. I mean, they're nationalizing, as you know, they nationalized the hydrocarbon industry. They have been establishing a system that looks very much like traditional Latin American populism. And yet, they're going through a huge boom. GDP growth in Bolivia has averaged about 4.6% in the last few years. I mean, they're doing better than they've done in the last 40, 50 years. Just to give you an idea how much money that is coming in terms of fiscal revenue because of that commodities bonanza. Between 2003 and 2010, so 6 or 7 years, fiscal revenue has grown by about 200%. It took the United States about 50 years to achieve the equivalent growth in fiscal revenue. Not that the growth of fiscal revenue is necessarily a good thing. That's not the point I'm trying to put across. I'm putting across the point that that's the effect that all of this globalization is having on a country like Bolivia. Again, if you look at Argentina, another country where we've seen nationalization, we've seen very high taxation, a lot of instability, a lot of unpredictability, a very corrupt political system. I mean, they seem to be headed in the wrong direction. And again, the boom that they're going through is really quite amazing. They've experienced average growth of between 8 and 9% for this decade. They keep raising taxes on their agricultural sector, which is really the driver of Argentina's economy right now. And the more taxes they place on them, the better they seem to do, and the more money that keeps coming into the country. And every time I go to Argentina, I predict this is the end. This is it. I mean, they're not going to survive all this level of taxation. And then I come back next year, and they show me statistics that indicate they're doing even better. So there's a huge distortion that this international environment is affecting in Latin America that, again, is helping everybody, including the people who seem to be going in the wrong direction. I think that's a huge challenge for us because, of course, if we're trying to persuade people that we need liberal democracy, a market economy, and globalization, at least those are the ideas that I believe in, it makes our case extremely difficult because governments have many statistics they can point to justify what they seem to be doing. And I think this is going to be a very interesting challenge. Having said that, there already are signs of weakness in those countries, in countries like, of course, Venezuela, but also Ecuador and Argentina, Bolivia, countries that seem to be doing well. I didn't mention Ecuador, but again, Ecuador is growing at a rate of 4%. And they seem to be, again, doing many things wrong. So they're showing the world pretty healthy statistics. But there are signs of weakness. If you look closely, if you go beyond the superficial, I mean, there are already signs of weakness there. And I think that we will see more of those in the next few years. In the case of Argentina, for instance, the model, the socioeconomic model that's in place is not sustainable. They have a hard time funding it. And that's why you've seen in recent years many moves on the part of the government to try and fund it, the very desperate moves. They nationalized the pension system. The pension system had traditionally been, of course, nationalized, and it went private, and it's been nationalized again. So the government just took over that pool of savings that was part of the private pension system. And not only that, they also took over part of the central bank reserves in order to fund some of the fiscal spending. So clearly they're desperate to be able to fund a system that is seeing fiscal spending grow even more than the revenue that's coming in from all this bonanza. So I think those are signs that something is not quite right. In the case of Venezuela, I think it's even more clear. Venezuela is the only country in the region this year that will have negative growth. Every single country in the region will be experiencing some form of positive growth. Venezuela will have negative growth. So clearly, those are signs of weakness. Even Bolivia, if you look at investment, most of the investment, by most I mean really 89, almost 90% is coming not from the private sector, but from the government. So again, this is a system that's entirely dependent on the ability of the government to generate fiscal revenue from the sale of these hydrocarbons. So if anything were to change in the overall environment, if prices were to change, clearly Bolivia would be in a lot of trouble. Ecuador is another country where some signs of weakness are already visible. Production of oil production, and they're heavily dependent on oil, as many of you probably know, has gone down very, very dramatically in recent years. Again, despite the skyrocketing price of oil, they've had fiscal problems again. So I think it's important to bear this in mind because that model, the populist authoritarian model, if you will, is one that was in place in Latin America for a long time. I would characterize the period from 1930 to 1980 as pretty much a period of economic nationalism combined with authoritarian populism. And clearly that not only did not develop Latin America, but it actually generated a crisis out of which the reforms of the 1990s came out. And we are pretty much copying that system in these countries. I really think that is not going to be sustainable in the long term. So it's important to start looking for signs of weakness in that system. I think that it's always difficult to when I say this, I get asked, well, what's the kind of reform that should take place in Latin America? What are the kinds of changes that need to take place in order for Latin America to ground its development and its growth on much firmer territory? And I think that this is a key question, of course, because if the model that some of these countries are following is not sustainable, then what we're going to see in a few years is a return to some of the conditions that prevailed